It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
Hope you're doing okay there in New York, really in the hot zone. I was going to say, I don't think we should be too hard on Donald Trump's handling of this crisis, because everybody knows that the prefrontal cortex, which controls judgment, doesn't fully develop until you're 75. I think that's correct, right?
Yeah.
It's around
He's
that.
a kid. He's a kid.
He's a kid. He's a kid. We can't expect much. And we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader, who has yet a new book coming out. It's called The Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, Classic Recipes from Lebanon and Beyond. Tell us about that, Ralph.
Well, it's heavily the Mediterranean diet, recipes by my mother largely, and nutrition these days is a good ingredient in improving resistance during this coronavirus crisis. So also it has very good pieces of wisdom about how my parents raised 4 children in a New England industrial town and used good judgment and tuition to get us never to complain about the food that they and we ate at the same time, so we could have good conversations around the table without distractions and whining. So all in all, it's a book for all seasons, but also has some relevance for people who are heavily on junk food and junk drink diets, and the need to transition to less expensive and far more nutritious and delicious diets from the Arab lands.
Very good. And we'll link that on the website and promote it again at the end of the show. And we have a great show, another great show for you today. I want to start by saying, if we were reliant on our devices before this pandemic, it's nothing compared to now. People are using online video conferencing for school, work, socializing, and exercise. The technological landscape has fundamentally changed in the last few weeks, and we are more dependent on big tech companies than ever before. Now more than ever, it's important that we talk about regulating tech companies in a way that benefits us all, especially since taxpayer dollars finance the development of the internet infrastructure they have all used and gotten rich off of. Our first guest is Ramesh Srinivasan, who is here to talk about how we can make tech more community-focused and the internet more democratic. He's also a Bernie Sanders surrogate, and as we all know by now, Bernie has suspended his campaign. We may talk a little bit about that too. That's just the first half of the show. In the second half, coronavirus has changed so much of our lives as we stay safely sheltered in place. But what about all of the people who might lose their shelter due to loss of income? Some cities have created coronavirus eviction bans, but some landlords are still finding ways around them to demand rent. Our second guest, Joe Cotchett, isn't requiring his Bay Area tenants to pay rent for the next 2 months to help them stay afloat during this crisis. We'll talk to Mr. Cotchett about how he hopes his move will inspire other landlords to also help out their tenants. And because even during a lockdown, corporate crime never sleeps, in fact, it may even flourish. In between, we will take a short break to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But let's start by talking about what a democratic internet would even look like. David?
Ramesh Srinivasan is a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, in the Department of Information Studies. He is the director of UC Digital Cultures Lab. His research investigates technology's relationship to democracy, public health, social change, and distance learning. Dr. Srinivasan is the author of Beyond the Valley: How Innovators Around the World Are Overcoming Inequality and Creating the Technologies of Tomorrow. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ramesh Srinivasan.
Oh, I'm very honored to join you. I've been such a huge fan and supporter of Ralph for decades now, and it's great to be in conversation and to add some insight and hopefully inspire folks to realize that there's so much we can do to get to a world that's more balanced and progressive and peoples-based.
Indeed, Ramesh. Let's get right into it, because I think by the time this interview's over, listeners, you're going to be looking at the internet with a much greater sense of empowerment and consequence. But before I ask you the first question, I want to lay the groundwork that you have laid in some of your op-ed articles in recent years, because it shows you that the control of the internet now by companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft is heading into very strong winds. And the question is whether we are going to be able to use this technology for the benefit of the many compared to what now is the benefit of the few financially. So there are four crises that we're heading into. One of them we're right in the middle now. The spread of viral and bacteria pandemics. This is not the first one, and it's not going to be the last one, the coronavirus. The second, of course, is climate disruption and the dramatic intensification of storms, fires, droughts, floods, sea levels, and the effect on the world. The third is what you point out is automation, and you point to an Oxford University study that says, listen to this, listeners, 47% of the jobs in developed nations will vanish in the next 25 years as a result of automation. And the fourth crisis is what I call elected dictatorial regimes. That is, populism coming under autocratic veneer, Trump style, and other dictators around the world. So if you put all those four together, you can start very, very fundamentally, Ramesh, and let me provoke you. What if there was no internet? Would we have been better prepared for the coronavirus, or would we have been less distracted, less complacent, and less dependent, and less procrastinating?
What a great question, and really great to tackle this with you in conversation, Ralph. This country has a pattern associated with it, and it's not just this country, it's much of the world after the kind of passage of all so-called neoliberal reforms, which is the costs again and again and again are socialized and the profits are privatized. So that creates a toxic system scale, right? And the internet is an example of this, right? The internet was publicly funded. The first node of the internet itself, the ARPANET, was right next to where I work at UCLA, just like, a 5-minute walk from my office. People invested in the internet, but as the internet followed the model that we see with roads, with National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health Research, everything followed the logic of private accumulated valuation, profitability, and speculated valuation. And so as a result of that greed and hoarding and the vocabulary of just making as much for oneself as possible, never minds the costs, all the costs got externalized and they all got dumped back onto us. So as a result, we see internet-driven systems that are racist, that are algorithmically inflammatory, right, where they basically are making selections around what we see based on the idea of riling us up rather than providing us a fact-based, a scientific-based, or even a sort of, harmonious kind of way of talking about our differences across different platforms. So the internet has followed that path that is so unfortunate that has infected so many of the opportunities for innovations to occur in ways that support public interests and business interests, but most importantly, support the interests of commonses and publics. And this is something you have spoken about for decades. And this is really no different when it comes to the internet itself. So there's an opportunity right now, and this is really what I see. There's an opportunity to do the inversion of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, to really take leadership in this digital area, but more generally in a vision that gives people what they're looking for and what they want. And people more than ever right now want technology, but they want a world more generally where they feel like the basics are taken care of, right? Where they are given healthcare, where they are given universal education, they're given universal income. These are huge ideas. And so what we're seeing happening is the biggest oligarchs in our world have made their money, not necessarily through traditional industries as much these days as through technology. So people like Michael Bloomberg are discussed as being big media moguls, but he made his money through technology. Technology is basically the mechanism by which oligarchic power is being established. And people shouldn't be concerned about this simply because of technology in and of itself, but technologies are gateway to everything from healthcare to criminal justice, to policing, and much, much more, to bank loans, and so on. So technologies need to be reimagined and regulated and reconfigured in the image of people. We can't allow privatized greed to destroy the 99%. And this is really what I'm trying to fight for in Beyond the Valley in my last book.
Ramesh, you started your argument with all the people giving their personal data free to Facebook, Google, Apple, others. And the old idea of whenever you get something free, you're the product. And you argue that we should get paid for this personal data, and we should be able to opt in or opt out. If we don't like the situation we're in, invading our personal space, manipulating us, deceiving us, giving this data to very shady operators who use it against us, we should be able to opt out. That's one point, and a very basic point in your reform. I've been arguing about this for years to no effect. But you also say that in order to deal with the worker insecurity and the exploitation, that you would like people to have a significant equity interest. That is, they would own part of the capital of the automation that replaces their jobs. So, obviously, technology doesn't have its own imperative. It doesn't fulfill its promises to the people if it slides right under a few giant corporations with influence in government. But why don't you talk about how the people can reassert control, and then we can talk about for what?
Yeah, great question. So, I like to sort of start by just a couple little sentences for the listeners to think about. Are we Googling or are we being Googled? When we go onto Facebook, are we socializing or are we being socialized? I think it's just important to think about whether we are users of the internet. I mean, that's the common term that's used, or whether we are being used. My point is there's an invisibility to all of the practices by which not only our data, but our attention, our behaviors, even our psychological states are being manipulated and shaped by private platforms, by private corporations for their own often hidden benefit. And you can see this game at work in very troubling manners. Take, for example, SEC filings by Uber. Uber loses money every month, every quarter. Uber is not a profitable business despite being valuated over $100 billion. Uber calls itself a technology company, but it's the biggest taxi company in the history of the world. Uber operates in many, many countries. I was in East and Central Africa doing fieldwork for this book, and I saw Uber in action there. But Uber is not accountable. These tech companies brand themselves as morally neutral, politically neutral, but in reality, they are the engines of accumulation of wealth. And so why is this so important in my mind? This is really, really important because the transference of wealth and power, and where we all are basically, we are all kind of essentially immersed on the internet, especially these days, but generally we're finding this to be the case, including with our younger generation. The transference of wealth, the transference of power, the ability to control the attention of so many people. I even talk about Aldous Huxley's Brave New World in this book. That power is in the hands of so few people in so few locations of the world who represent such demographic homogeneity, right? We're talking mainly white male oligarchs, younger oligarchs in many cases. That is so troubling because that is the engine that is now amplifying the profound inequalities we see in our country. 3 people with equivalent wealth to 50%. In the world, 8 people with equivalent wealth to almost 4 billion people. And so that's why what we need to do is not just necessarily give people handouts within a system that's so broken, that's so extractive. We need to figure out ways to rewrite the rules by which technology provides value to all, right? So I understand I get some value. I'm willing to admit it through Google, maybe a little bit less value through Facebook. But at the same time, what is the other side of that ledger? Is that even available or accessible to me as a user? So what I think we need to do is really think about the instruments of equity, the instruments of value that's accumulated through these technologies. The technologies are amazing. People deserve some credit for their innovations with technology, but it can't come in a zero-sum manner where everybody else is essentially screwed.
Well, let's inject some skepticism here. and that is, by the way, listeners, Ramesh boils all this down in a digital Bill of Rights in his book, and it's a kind of Bill of Rights that can come by a public awareness through Congress. You got to pay more attention, Ramesh, through Congress. It's got to be through Congress, or it's got to be very powerful cooperative organizing efforts by the consumers, which is even more difficult these days. I always like to look at technology and say, before it came on the scene, did it really improve things? All right, let's start with this. We have now technology. Elections are in a total mess. the software, the automation, the hacking, the proprietary control of the software by the companies that sell the machines to the state governments. Across the border in Canada, they didn't fall for that. They still have paper ballots, and they know by 11 o'clock who won and who didn't in a vast land. Number two, what has all this internet done for poverty? Alleviation of poverty. What has it all done for improving civic empowerment? It was supposed to really revolutionize the power of the many, to hold the power of the few accountable.
Absolutely.
It hasn't done that. What has it done on corporate crime? Has it developed the kind of corporate crime databases? No, because the Justice Department has never done it. Why? Because the Justice Department is under the heavy influence of the corporate law firms and the corporate lobbyists. So the technology has failed miserably. What has it done for public awareness of the military-industrial complex, the kinds of upgrades, $1.5 trillion to upgrade nuclear weapons, stockpiling nuclear weapons, but not stockpiling ventilators and face masks and swabs and hospital facilities? So why don't you attack it at its roots in order to destroy its propaganda credibility that is now imposed by 3 or 4 giant companies with government backing?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I believe that we need to give workers and the public greater equity and governance over all these technologies. As you said, technologies themselves, they aren't necessarily standing for particular aims or values or visions. The question is one of governance and ownership and equity. And so I can imagine, corporate corruption being completely exposed through visualization technologies, but that can only occur if the kind of value, if those holding the instruments of power over that technology are more pluralized, right? So imagine an Uber, for example, where the workers of Uber, instead of being completely exploited like we see with the gig economy, right? Instead of them making $4 to $5 an hour, less than a third of a living wage, if they actually had equity in the business themselves, they actually owned the business. Those are the kind of alternatives we have to propose. We have to start creating commonses in terms of the governance and ownership of technology. Otherwise, absolutely every single thing you say is absolutely accurate, and I completely agree. The question is one of power.
Let me interject here. You can't change an entrenched plutocratic oligarchic technological system without first delegitimizing it before you even say what the reforms have got to be. We have to delegitimize the supremacy of horsepower and style in the production of automobiles, which are killing people every day and wasting enormous economic resources, before people are ready to listen. Most people are under seance. They love the internet. It is entertaining. Video games, massive video games. Right. It's informative. Sometimes it's educational. It's distracting. It relieves depression. It connects people with impersonal text messages. They are Pavlovian specimens now. They're Pavlovian specimens. How do you begin to delegitimize it in saying that this internet, $4 trillion, as you say in your book, industry a year, is not solving any of the problems in our country? I remember giving an address to a technology company in the late 1960s in the Santa Monica area. And the place was full with very optimistic people. It was the early computer age. And I said, let's talk about the computer and the consumer. What is the computer going to do to develop rigorous information standards and feedback mechanisms for complaints? And they said it's going to revolutionize it. Well, we're still waiting. Let me put it this way. For all the work consumer advocates have done over the decades, the consumers are being financially, economically exploited far more than they ever were when you consider the fine print contract developments, the payday loan rackets, the lack of grievance procedures, the unpaid balances and interest rates. People are just being bounced around. Admitted, the cars are safer. This didn't require the internet. There are other advances. Lead is no longer in people's body because it's out of gasoline and paint. I think you need a structural functional analysis, Ramesh. No one's better able to do this, to delegitimize and wake people up. Because if you don't wake people up, if you don't raise their expectations and get them steamed up, they're not going to want to support these reforms because they don't think anything is all that bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to expose all of the negative externalities and make them really, really visible to people. And this is a time, by the way, I completely agree. This is a time to actually do that, right? Where we all, ironically enough, are stuck at home looking at our phones, looking at our computers on these technology platforms. We have to make it extremely clear. And so I try to, in Beyond the Valley, show a bunch of examples that show the incredible forms of injustice and inequality that are fueled by the internet of today. And I do agree with you that we are addicted to, and we see the internet as really the engine of all our lives, right? And in a sense, consumption and desire and even emotion are manipulated algorithmically by these private technological systems. However, I do want to point to one little, ray of sunshine that I see, like kind of scouring polls and looking at literature, which is, there are various polls I've seen, and I was talking to, some people in Senator Warren's campaign about this, as well as the Sanders campaign, which I, represented, and I'm very honored to have represented. And we were looking at polls that saw about 75% of Americans are interested in regulatory reform of some kind. Now, that's very vague, and you know better than anybody, that might mean nothing, right? But I do see there's a little open spot. Often it's for little Trojan horses like the Russia thing or the Cambridge Analytica thing, which are meaningful symbolically, but that don't actually address the fact of systemic structural injustice that is encoded into the internet today. But I say, let's go with the Trojan horse and then open people up to all of the ways in which these technologies are disenfranchising them, especially Black and brown people and working class people. And I give a lot of examples in Beyond the Valley of how these technologies are turning out to be racist and classist and so on.
And we're going to get to that because Ramesh has gone all over the world, and he's found that the more sensible uses of the internet are taking place in the poorest countries. People in Kenya, a great example, we'll talk about in a minute, the area of Oaxaca and the indigenous people in the mountains of Oaxaca, where, by the way, my sister did her field work with the Zapotecs and has been teaching at Berkeley for many years anthropology.
I've actually read her book on Talea de Castro, and I meant to tell you about that. So she's another heroic figure. So there's at least two naders that are like that in my life.
But let me just ask you, I want to ask you this. Even in the best of scenarios with the internet, the way you envision, there's one fatal flaw, and that's its all-encompassing interpersonality. It is not person to person. It can lead to, announcements of meetings, town meetings, marches, rallies, etc. But the more people live in virtual reality, the less likely they're going to want to meet. In fact, they don't even have the personal skills now for two-way live telephone calls among young people anymore.
Right.
And so how do you deal with that? Because nothing happens without people-to-people meeting. Yeah. You can have all the internet you want, but the jury is still out as to whether it can alone make social change without devolving or evolving contemporaneously into neighborhood meetings, into the meetings that have built democratic processes and given us whatever blessings we have. How do you deal with this fatal flaw?
Yes, a couple things. First of all, we do see again and again and again positive correlations between, more and more internet use and more mobile app use and depression and a difficulty in experiencing sort of intimacy, emotional vulnerability, psychological vulnerability. And I do point to some of that research in Beyond the Valley. So that's a huge issue. When I'm texting with someone else, it's not really the same as embodied presence, mindfulness, really engaged and present communication. So you're absolutely right about that. But at scale, this can be a huge problem. And this relates to a term that we sometimes use in academia we call slacktivism, where you're kind of like an activist, but you're kind of a slacker. You're just, passing on a petition and so on. And this was an issue that I actually investigated on the ground for 3 years, 3 summers, 2011, 2012, and 2013 in Egypt, in the midst of the Arab Spring. And I was looking at how the Western corporate capitalist rhetoric of these people are saved by our technologies because it's the so-called Facebook revolution, total BS. On the ground, you actually find people who are actually, almost nobody is using these technologies in the context of collective action, large-scale mobilization. And luckily, people who were subversive and tactical, who had access to these technologies, use them in ways to manipulate and shape global journalism and global sentiment. So The technologies are not necessarily catalysts for in-person collective action and organizing. There is space for hackers, there is space for media manipulation and so on, but it is a huge problem. It makes us feel, in a sense, alone together, and that's kind of a real problem that we have here.
We're talking with Ramesh Srinivasan, the author of Beyond the Valley, published by the prestigious MIT Press. He's walking down the street in Nairobi, Kenya, and what do you see?
It's incredible. So, we often hear the term, necessity is the mother of invention. I like to open up to another word. Necessity is the mother of innovation. And this is something I know, and many of our listeners know, that when we go into places and communities, not just in our country, but all over the world, where people have less, where they have less resources, they're not as deluded by this myth of infinite resources that we know is not true, but that's the narrative that capitalism kind of spins upon all of us. But people who have less are able to innovate with less. And this is something I've seen in action, not just in Nairobi and Kenya, but actually all over the world. I see it even here in Los Angeles, in South LA, or even in certain areas of downtown, all across the world, all across Latin America, which is people are taking whatever is around them and they're hustling. They're figuring out ways to work with scarcity and innovate with those constraints.
Using the internet, right?
Partly using the internet, but partly just using detritus, the residue of the internet. So like,
okay, well, what did you find on that street in Kenya?
Yeah. So in Kibera, for example, which is a large settlement, community in the middle of Nairobi, I saw people repairing every technology imaginable, from cell phones to, old cathode ray TVs to chairs to wheels, everything that is designed to die, everything that dies, everything that dies. And we know Apple designs its phones to die. It's called planned obsolescence, much like Monsanto designs its seeds to die. But everything that's dead is given new life by these innovators. They're literally on the street just figuring out how to fix things. They're just kind of hacking things in various ways. And they're selling repaired devices, repaired technologies of all kinds back in the informal market. And that is what people are able to survive on. And here's the thing that really blew my mind. I didn't just see this with things like mobile phones. I didn't just see this with older technologies, but I also saw this with 3D printers. And this is something I talk about in the book. People in Kenya, they're called Jua Kali, which in Swahili means hot sun. And they literally set up tables underneath the hot sun with a soldering gun, and they just learn by doing. They just figure out ways to hack and repair things. And this is what they did with 3D printers as well. They took discarded electronics, electronic waste. This is something we often don't talk about, how the digital world promotes incredible amount of energy consumption as well as waste, electronic waste, massive amounts of waste. This is something that is often another externality that nobody talks about or knows about, or very few people. I saw people taking electronic waste, discarded circuit boards, wires, just things that would be treated as junk, and actually building 3D printers out of about 60-70% of waste parts. And they built 3D printers. They're called, one of the groups is called Africa Born 3D. They built these 3D printers because they only were able to afford figuring out a way to do that with whatever was considered waste. And they built 3D printers that not only outperformed American and Chinese 3D printers, but they're a fraction of the price. And so they have built an entrepreneurial model from the grassroots based on notions of sustainability, not as some branding category, but out of reality. Because you got to do what you can. You got to hustle with what you can based on what's around you.
And you're saying these 3D printers in a street corner in Nairobi were making everything from medical devices to household appliances out of all this waste product and circuits and wires that they salvaged? Are you serious?
Blows your mind when you see it. It's a heuristic process. It's a process of learning by doing. It's a little bit of trial and error. People are trying to figure out what works with what. These are not people with fancy degrees from MIT or, all these schools that, in the West that we think of as the production, as the producers of elite engineers. These are people who learn by doing, learn by playing, learn by creating, learn by repairing, learn by recycling. And that's because it's not because they're, noble environmentalists, even though the crisis of environmental injustice hits them in a very real and material way. It's because that's all they have to work with. And that is really
these
incredible.
These medical devices and household appliances, you say, that comes out of these 3D printers on a street in Nairobi are, quote, not only are they a fraction of the cost of Chinese and even American printers, they're also far more robust and resilient, able to withstand the heat, noise, and elements of this East African country. Why? Because they were designed by Kenyans for their local environment and federal countrymen, end quote. Let's go to Oaxaca's mountains. What did you discover there?
So what we see happening in Oaxaca, and we've actually seen this all over the world, is there is a technology that exists that really has served and supported communities, meaning communities as people living in places with actually real ideas of interdependence and governance and traditional histories and so on. And that is the technology of community radio. And that is the model. The community radio model has influenced innovators in places like Oaxaca to build community-owned cell phone networks and community-owned intranet networks, which are basically local communication networks, and pathways to access the wider internet. And this is a movement we see happening all over the world. But in Oaxaca, we see across dozens of indigenous Zapotec, Mixtec, and Mixe communities, we see communities owning and building collectively. They collectively own and design their own digital cell phone networks, meaning that any value that's provided out of the network is redistributed in the community. Employment is local. People together make decisions in very, very directly democratic ways. They call them asambleas or assemblies. They come together and they make decisions about what kind of network they want and why. And so people are able to take power over technology truly in a community-based way. And there are dozens of these networks that exist now, not just in Oaxaca, but we see this model spreading. It's the rhizomatic model. The project is called Teléfono Indígena Comunitaria, Indigenous Community Telephony. But they are really influenced by the concept of the rhizome, the political philosophy that almost in a subversive, decentralized way, anybody anywhere can do it themselves. They can create their own networks. And so we see this happening now in Colombia. We see it happening in West Papua, which is, fighting for political sovereignty. We see this happening in Brazil. We see this happening in Argentina. We see this happening in Catalonia. These are models that exist where people are able to take power over technology in resilient ways. We even saw this happening in Red Hook in Brooklyn during Superstorm Sandy, where the community was able to keep its own communication network alive amidst the climate crisis. We see it happening in Detroit with the Detroit Community Technology Project and Allied Media. Those guys have been doing a lot of great work in this area. So I just want to make the point that the game is not over. It just depends on what scale. The game is not over when it comes to technology serving people's based interests. And so, I know you can read a little bit of optimism and progressivism in my writing and my speaking. It's because I really believe that there's an opportunity. We got to fight to transform technology in the image of people.
Well, we're obviously not seeing it adequately reported in this country. Far more attention is given in the mass media to the latest techno-twit app that comes out of Silicon Valley. And then all this remarkable innovation born out of poverty, born out of desperation, born out of the inability to buy a planned obsolescence Apple phone to give Apple enormous profit margins. Well, we're going to have another program with you on, Ramesh, to talk about the Digital Bill of Rights in Congress. It's got to have much more focus on those 535 members of Congress to make this all happen, and we can make it because back home we certainly outnumber corporations in terms of aroused and committed voters. But you were a surrogate for Bernie Sanders. Let's have some of your brief thoughts before we have to conclude on his suspending his campaign and whether it's just another strategy or throwing in the towel to Delaware Joe Biden.
Well, nothing but love and appreciation that I have personally and that many of my, compatriots have for what Bernie represents and has represented in our country. I feel in many ways he took the mantle that was kind of put out into the public sphere with the Occupy movement that I was involved with the Arab Spring that I was involved with more as a scholar and in solidarity. His positions, I believe, have been mistakenly portrayed as radical, The term socialist is a bad word in this country because of the history of propaganda. And I really
not
believe
anymore. Socialism is king out of Washington, Trump style, bailing out big capitalism.
Yes, and that's why I feel that it's a huge opportunity right now where Americans really see the value of universal healthcare or socialized healthcare, of socialized employment guarantees and work guarantees and being paid amidst this crisis. It's time now for some real leaders. We have to step up, and workers need to take power right now. Otherwise, we're going to have the inversion. You're going to have the shock doctrine all over again. This is what I've been trying to say. I'm really hopeful that out of our movement, out of Bernie's leadership, even with him stepping down today, that something's going to emerge out of this vacuum, because we're in this liminal space right now where I feel it's time for people to really step up, to support what Bernie has proposed in terms of policies, but actually say, hey, workers, you need to take power and demand these kinds of changes. And I feel like that, again, I am an optimist, so I feel like that can really happen. Noam Chomsky has pointed out that, in the past with the original New Deal, remember, there was that second New Deal, the second Bill of Rights that FDR proposed that never came to be, right? But the way we can get that to happen is there has to be coordinated actions with workers. And all of these work acts, that the killing of unions, like the Taft-Hartley Act, have really harmed worker power. So I feel like here's an opportunity. Now is this time. We're all stuck at home. We're all glued to the internet. Let's move now. Let's figure out ways in which people can fight and mobilize and take power around these issues. Well, and, Bernie stepping down is sad, but at the same time, I understand his service and I appreciate it.
Well, he's going to continue to the convention with his candidates. He has hundreds of candidates, and his name will remain on the ballot in upcoming primaries. So we'll see what negotiating power and leverage he and the movement behind him continues to have.
My hope is that we can build, though, off of this, that there's an opportunity to build and fight. And I feel like now's the time to make some moves. That's what I feel. I'm at the minimum going to be writing, but I want to speak out in public as much as possible, whatever public means right now. And, that's why me joining you today, has been a hero to me for decades, Ralph, is an opportunity for this.
Well, thank you. But we do have to pay attention to the serious problem of lack of civic motivation, to mobilize in the interests of the citizens themselves and focus on Congress. That's got to be the next trajectory. Unfortunately, Ramesh, we're out of time. We've been talking with Ramesh Srinivasan, who is the author of a really powerful book called Beyond the Valley, meaning Beyond Silicon Valley, which studies the relationships between technologies, politics, economics, and societies across the world as if people matter first and foremost. Thank you very much, Ramesh. To be continued for sure.
It's a huge honor, and I can't wait to join you in conversation again. And please let me know anytime how I can support you and what you stand for. Thank you for all your leadership.
We've been speaking with Ramesh Srinivasan about his new book, Beyond the Valley. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we will hear from attorney and landlord Joe Cotchett about what he is doing to help out his tenants during the lockdown.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Thursday, April 2, 2020. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Stanley Sporkin, the crusading chief enforcement officer of the Securities and Exchange Commission in the 1970s, died last week in Rockville, Maryland. That's according to a report in the Washington Post. At the SEC, where he spent 7 years as the agency's director of enforcement, Sporkin led lawyers whom he called the finest law firm in the country in bold actions against such well-known companies as Gulf, Exxon, Mobil, Lockheed, R.J. Reynolds, and 3M for trying to bribe political figures in foreign countries. One of Sporkin's first major SEC cases resulted in the 1974 conviction of George Steinbrenner, a shipbuilder and owner of the New York Yankees, for illegal campaign contributions. The chairman of Lockheed was ousted after admitting to funneling $22 million in payoffs to foreign politicians. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. San Francisco has started moving homeless people off of the streets and into the city's now empty hotels. This lets people self-isolate and not infect others. With this particular crisis, it's more important than ever to keep people housed. Another thing that is helping people stay housed is stopping evictions. That's what we're going to talk about with our next guest. David?
Joe Cotchett is a prominent lawyer who built his career by representing the underdog against powerful interests. Mr. Cotchett is a property owner in Half Moon Bay in the Bay Area. He is waiving 2 months' rent for his 65 Half Moon Bay tenants to help keep these businesses afloat during the pandemic. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Joe Cotchett.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here, especially given these incredible times we're going through.
Thank you indeed, Joe. And people should know Joe's not just a lawyer and a landlord. He's an author. One of his books is called The People versus Greed, Stealing America, Main Street versus Wall Street, The Continued Erosion of Ethics in Our Professions, Business, and Government. And this is full of facts that affect you every day, people. And Joe, this isn't the first time you've done this. As a landlord, you have properties, 65 retail tenants in Half Moon Bay in California. This isn't the first time you've done it. Tell us about the last time and why you've done it this time.
I did it in 2008 when we went through a last crisis. And let me just back up and say this. I'm a lawyer, and that's my primary occupation. But as people know who know me, I'm involved in a lot of civic and community activities. And I really think of myself as someone who would like to change the way this economy is functioning. The book you just mentioned, People versus Greed, what we do in my law firm is we basically take on Wall Street and the greed of corporate America who takes advantage of people. Now, the fact that I'm a landlord came about in the 70s when some people over in Half Moon Bay, which is the Bay Area of San Francisco, small community, they were having some economic problems with the building. I represented one of them. I went over and I helped them through their problems with the building. They eventually paid me back and asked me if I would take the building. I took it reluctantly. And then following that, I just got active in Half Moon Bay, which is a fabulous little community, like many communities across America. As a matter of fact, its main street is called Main Street. And I acquired other buildings. And what I have in there are little restaurants, little shops. It's right on the ocean. These people work, like many Americans do, month to month to make their earnings. I don't want to give the impression I own major commercial buildings. I do not. I own a number of buildings with all small retail, restaurants, merchants. I have some doctors. I have some accountants. I have some professional people in offices. And to be brutally candid with you, in 2008, that recession hit. I wasn't about to say to a small little restaurant, for example, all right, terminate your dishwashers, your service people, your cooks. Instead, I said, look, let's all get on our feet here and keep Main Street, Main Street. Now, let me take off my hat just for a moment of my heart and put on my economic hat. This is what I try and stress to people all over California. Look, if you own a building and you have tenants in it, the math and economics are very simple. Now I'm talking throw away the heart, just put the economic hat on. If you own a building with some small tenants in it and they go out bankrupt, whatever it may be, they close, what do you think happens to the value of your building? It goes to nothing because a building without a commercial building without tenants, as we all know, is worth nothing. So if you put the heart aside just for a moment, even economically, it is important that people that own commercial buildings realize that we're all in a boat together and you must row that boat. If you do not row that boat with the little retail or whoever it may be, I keep using the word retail as little, and I'll come back to that. If you do not row that boat, the value of your buildings, whatever they may be, is going to be nothing. So you are going to lose in the big picture. So my suggestion is for everybody to think about their heart, get in the boat, row it together. Everybody at the end of the day will then be in a better position than they were being put out on the street. It's not rocket science. It is not being a big-hearted person. It is common sense. It is common sense what we have to do all over America today. I mean, I am dumbfounded, absolutely dumbfounded to see recently some commercial tenants in both Los Angeles and San Francisco not only not reducing rents, but increasing rents.
Oh, my God.
The folly, the craziness, and of course, being the type person I am, I point this all back to the Trump administration.
There are people who agree with you. The New York Times report a few days ago, Joe, about Mario Salerno, who is...
I read that article. God bless that person.
Yeah, he's a Brooklyn landlord, and he has forgiven the rent in April to hundreds of his tenants. And he announced it by putting a sign on all the buildings that quoted this way. They woke up one morning, they saw the sign, quote, "Stay safe, help your neighbors, and wash your hands, and you don't have to pay April rent." And then he said, thank you, Mario. But as you say, most of the landlords are either charging the same or charging more, taking advantage of it. There's a corporate crime spree springing up with all this $2.2 trillion being shoveled out. There's going to be a lot of defective products, a lot of wrongful injury, a lot of commercial scams, and the companies are pushing for legal immunity, Joe. They want
I see that, yes.
So what's your view of all this? Because this may be a terrible backfire against existing rights that wrongfully injured people have today.
Yeah, well, let's go back just 1 minute to the gentleman in Brooklyn. I wrote him a note. I was so proud of what he did, and I hope his conduct forces others to think the way he did. Now, talking about where we're going in that direction, it is clear that Nancy Pelosi and others saw that under the, I think it's called the CARES Act, the CR.
That's right. It's called the CARES Act, CARES. Yeah.
Yeah. I think they saw under that there could be wild exploitation of the money going out. I don't want to be so harsh, but I read an article in the paper that some of that could be going to the Trump hotel organizations. Now, look, Nancy and her cohorts in Congress are now going to deal with that and have dealt with that partially. I say partially because it's not clear to me yet who is going to run and oversee the distribution of that money. You know, and I know there's going to be phony medicines put out there on the street. There are going to be all kinds of phony issues surrounding the whole virus problem. We're seeing it daily. You go into stores and you see toilet paper went from what? 76 cents average a roll to $14 a roll here in the Bay Area.
Oh.
It is extraordinary, the rape and pillage that is going on, and that our so-called government, whether they be local, state, or national, are not cracking down on that. It is outrageous. You see it going on. You know, what are we talking about? We're talking about $2 trillion right now. Is that the number?
Yeah, and
you
there's
know
more
how
trillions
much of
coming. More trillions
and more
coming.
come. And you know, as shown in 2008, how many executives of corporate America bought back stock and paid themselves bonuses. I mean, it is scandalous. It is outrageous. Thank God for people like Nancy Pelosi that recognized that and took a hard stand against it. The problem we're faced with is I'm not so sure how hard that is going to be policed. Police meaning how clearly they are going to watch for the rape and pillage that's going on to get their hands on that money.
It's a corporate crime spree. It's going to be up to the attorney generals of the states. The Justice Department's talking big time, but they're not going to do anything. This may be a very serious adverse effect to the Trump campaign come November, Joe, because people are going to see how they're being ripped off at skyrocket gouging levels in the stores when there are temporary scarcities.
Yeah, I hope you're right, Ralph. Here's my comment to that. As a lawyer, we do know that it may be that the attorney generals of various states, the attorney general of California, for example, the attorney general of New York, two fabulous people, are not going to have the opportunity because we're talking about economic dollars and we're talking about federal law. And it may be that it's only the Department of Justice that can crack down, and we sure as hell know that Barr is not going to put that memo out.
That's for sure. I think what we're seeing here is a real crisis where out of it, the corporations can become more powerful than ever. They can become immunized for more lawsuits than ever. Or we can have a democratic resurgence, progressive style, where we cut back on their power, hold them accountable, and change the type of people who represent us in Washington and other state capitals.
But go back just for a minute, and here's the problem. That's very nice to say, Ralph. I'm glad to hear those words come out of your mouth, that the practical aspect is the law is moving forward as we speak today. CARES, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, is moving forward as we speak. And who is policing that? That's the problem. So that money is going to get out. And to be brutally candid with you, look, the average person on the street, 60% live month to month, paycheck to paycheck. You don't really think, let's be clear about this, you don't really think that that person on the street who's living paycheck to paycheck is going to have any in-depth knowledge of the new CARE Relief Act. They are not. It goes back to our elected officials, and the fact of the matter is that there's only so much they can do. And what I'm saying to you is that unfortunately, I don't think the attorney generals, the state attorney generals, are going to have much say in that, Ralph. I would love to see them step up to the plate and look at this carefully. I don't know that the law provides for that.
Well, we need private civil action too, that your firm is so well known for. And we need more class actions. We need massive infusions of small claims courts, and we need to prosecute some of the big fat cats, put them in black and white stripes, and make an example, which was not the case in 2008. Nobody went to jail from these Wall Street speculators and rip-off artists.
Quite to the contrary, they were able to sell stock back and gave themselves bonuses. But go back to the point you just made. You're right. Let me tell you some of the cases we're just filing that you'll find of interest. For example, we're going after several insurance companies that have taken premiums for years and years, especially in the recent 5 or 10 years when the economy has been moving. They've been taking premiums for business interruption. Now we have business interruption. Every other store that you look out at and see plywood on has been interrupted by this virus. They're taking the position, all these insurance companies nationwide, that is not covered by business interruption. We're filing lawsuits against some of the biggest insurance companies in America to get the courts to rule that, yes, it certainly does. What is more of a business interruption than you are told by your local authority that you must close your store? I don't care whether it's a fire, whether it's a leaky pipe, or whether it's a virus. The fact of the matter is, you're told to close. That's called a business interruption. How about all the people that buy tickets through entities for events all over the country? They've now bought tickets, by the way, for the baseball season. They bought tickets for the basketball season. They even bought tickets for the Tokyo Olympics. And they are being refused money back from airlines, from everyone, for their deposits that they put up. Who is going to go after these people? Do you think it's going to be the federal government? I doubt that. And therein lies the problem. And that's why private law firms have to get involved representing individuals in class actions. By the way, a very prominent lawyer, I won't mention the law firm, just referred to class actions as another method for communists to take over our judicial system. Can you imagine that?
Well, people are becoming alert to asking the following questions. If there's less traffic, there are fewer traffic accidents. Why aren't we getting a rebate on insurance, on auto insurance? Well, Allstate insurance companies, one of 2 or 3 already, who said they're going to give rebates back to their policyholders. You pay for your cable monthly fee, and there are no sports. So why aren't you getting a rebate? So be very demanding, consumers. Every area that you're paying your bills may be able to get a refund or a rebate. And if you can't, be alert to these class actions that are being filed all over the country. Steve, David, any final questions or comments?
Joe, as a practical
Yes,
matter, how long can you afford to go on like this and forgive rent?
Yeah, I was just going to ask.
Yeah. Is this Steve or David?
Steven.
Look, I've been blessed in my practice. I've done well. I'm going to go on as long as we have to go on that's reasonable. And by reasonable, I mean wait. And I told all the tenants in our buildings, we're doing no rent for April and May. And I said specifically in writing so there can be no doubt. And if this lingers into June, July, we will further consider that. And I'm saying this openly, publicly. When these people are in trouble, we're going to help them. And that's all I can say, in the sense that your heart is going to decide that.
Well, we're out of time. Thanks very much, Joe. And if you think we can help spread what you're doing, just give us the information, because landlords like you and Mr. Salerno in Brooklyn really throw up the other landlords up against the wall with the question, well, what about you? And 40% of the renters in New York City couldn't make April rent, which was due on Wednesday. That's how bad it is in New York City. So thank you for your example, Joe, and your advocacy behind the example, giving interviews from media who call you from the Bay Area and around the country. Thanks again, Joe.
Steve, David, Ralph, thank you for what you're doing.
We've been speaking with Joe Cotchett about his efforts to help his tenants stay afloat during this crisis. I want to thank both our guests again, Ramesh Srinivasan and Joe Cotchett. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material, and we've got a lot of it, and we call it the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph Nader's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has got 3 books out. The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformedcongress.org. Fake President, Decoding Trump's Gaslighting, Corruption, and General BS, co-written with Mark Green, and the one we talked about at the top of the show, the Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, Classic Recipes from Lebanon and Beyond. We will link to that also.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our intern is Michaela Squire.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Stay safe, everybody, and start demanding your rebates.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we talk a little more to both of our guests. First up, Ralph asked Ramesh about something called xenobots.
Tell us about xenobots briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're seeing more and more are, algorithmic and AI systems. And this is something I touch on in the book. Every one of the big tech companies call themselves AI companies now. And AI is a real problem because all of us have these phones in our pocket that are constantly emitting data. But also, it's not just that data. I know you've talked about this before. When we use our credit cards, when we're digitally recorded in various ways, we're providing data all the time, even through things like credit cards, right? So all of that is being accumulated by these AI and algorithmic systems. And it turns out that many of those systems are showing xenophobic, racist, and classist tendencies in their deductions because they are systems that are built generally by, if you will, global north, American or maybe Chinese, tech engineers who have these biases built into their own lives, their own worlds, because just when we all have biases, but they're learning from data sets that reflect xenophobic tendencies. And here's the key point. These technologies are making visible to us what will get our attention and also our addiction, as you alluded to, Ralph. So what gets our attention, it turns out, is sometimes extremely hateful content. And that's one of the big reasons why our president is such a great messenger. I mean, he's great at messaging through these new technologies. He himself, he represents a certain kind of, public figure that works with this dystopic technological world that we're increasingly arriving at.
Mm-hmm. I just want to give people a sense that technology is racing ahead without an ethical and legal framework for accountability.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
just tell them what's on the scene in synthetic biology with xenobots. I don't want to scare them too much. By the way, AI stands for artificial intelligence. And just tell them about that. And you probably read that great article over 18 years ago by Bill Joy in Wired magazine called "The Future Doesn't Need Us." And he outlined nanotechnology, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, out of control. And Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and others wrote a letter a few years ago saying if we don't control artificial intelligence or robots, they'll destroy the world. So these are not alarmists, these are hardcore scientists, business people, etc. Just give them a sense before we go to Kenya and Oaxaca. What is a xenobot?
Sure. So this is really, what we're heading to more and more, and feel free to kind of add to what I'm saying, Ralph. What we're heading to more and more is through revolutionary breakthroughs in nanotech and bioengineering, as well as AI technologies or artificial intelligence technologies, is basically producing certain kinds of, new types of species of robotic systems that are intelligent, that have bodies and so on, that actually can supplant various types of human activity. This is very terrifying for many people. Sounds like something from Black Mirror or, like a science fiction show in many ways. And here's the thing that I just want to point to, and feel free to have me elaborate on this. A lot of these major figures in tech who publicly say lots of negative things about the technologies of the future and even of today are investing in those technologies. And that's why you brought up Elon Musk. Elon Musk constantly talks about how troubling and disastrous AI potentially is, while being one of the main figures profiting off of those forms of investment himself. And there's a certain type of cynicism you see amongst the oligarchs in the world, as if they know what they're doing, much like the climate crisis, as if they know what they're doing is actually contributing to the disasters that we're seeing all over the world. And that's why you see massive investments in space, as well as in post-apocalyptic things like nuclear bunkers and so on. I mean, Jeff Bezos from Amazon himself said that the only way he can realistically see his money being, given to is through his own private corporate space travel company. So there's a level of cynicism where they know what they're creating, and that's why it's so darn important. And you said technology often kind of advances more rapidly than ethical or political arguments, but we have to regulate the heck out of this and expose people to what's going on. Otherwise, the future for our children is going to be much worse even than it is for us, in the context of these existential crises, too, that you mentioned.
You mentioned Jeff Bezos. In one of your articles, you say, quote, Amazon warehouse workers make a median wage of $28,466 a year, while the company's CEO, Jeff Bezos, makes $8,961 an hour, end quote. Is that accurate?
It is not only accurate, but it's really important to look at those workers and the conditions by which those workers are living. They are dispensable. They are going to be replaced by automated systems, and they are actually being tracked with wristbands, very Taylorist, right? Like earlier industrial capitalism, right? Like time motion studies. I know you know all about this stuff, where people are actually being tracked as cogs in a machine to then optimize whatever data that can be gathered by them for robotic systems. The same thing is also true with Uber drivers as well. So the massive injustices associated with technology as a catalyst for economic and political injustice is a huge issue. And you can even see it if you're able to get into those fulfillment centers at Amazon itself. And that's why I think it's really important that we see these people striking right now, obviously amidst the coronavirus situation.
And was that $8.9 million an hour a typo?
I will double check that, but I believe that was correct. I mean, it might be based on certain conditions of how many hours are being counted. It's probably not 24 hours. It might be, I can double check that, but definitely I fact checked everything I could in the book.
And now Steve and David ask questions of Ramesh concerning the election.
Just like to have Steve and David pitch in with any comment or question they may have.
Sure.
Joe Biden, Ramesh, says we don't have time for a revolution. How would you respond to that?
That's incredibly tone deaf. And I think that there's a lack of understanding amongst Joe Biden. And this was very similar to what we saw with Hillary Clinton in 2016 of the conditions that led us to Trump. What are the conditions that brought us Trump? What was the situation of worker disenfranchisement, of economic disenfranchisement, of massive injustice, of neoliberal trade agreement sellouts that Trump was speaking to? Of course, he was lying about it. He gave the biggest tax cut in history to the oligarchs of our country, to the 1%. But at the same time, you have to fight fire with fire. And it's time for Joe Biden to really listen to what our campaign was about and understand that what we need is a political movement. You can call it revolution or not, but what we need is real change. And for Biden to think that Trump is a temporary blip on a system that was somehow, going in the right direction is completely ignorant of material realities that can be deduced not just in people's experiences, but in hard quantitative data around, healthcare, education, student debt, economic injustices, economic inequalities. It is time to act, and Biden better do that or he's going to lose.
Well, there'll be a lot of Bernie voters who won't vote in the key states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. My message to Joe Biden, among many, is watch what you wish for, Joe.
Let's see if Biden is willing to really embrace what we stand for. I mean, I question that, but maybe Bernie's decision today means that he feels like he has a pipeline to influence this. But I do believe that transformative change is needed, especially right now where people are really suffering.
David?
How do we vote? How do we use this digital technology to carry an election in November?
We are nowhere near the point, and Ralph and I were speaking about it earlier, where we should be trusting digital technologies for our votes. I think we're going to have to figure out a system of voting that is more traditional paper ballot based. And I don't know what that's going to mean with the virus occurring. I don't want to get into, feeling scared or anxious about it, but I'm concerned about what Trump might do in the context of this pandemic in terms of trying to delay the election or postpone the election or say some, shady stuff about it. But I do know that we're nowhere near the point where we're ready to use the internet as a mechanism for even a representative democracy, let alone a peoples-based democracy. Yeah.
Do you worry with Biden as the nominee, too many activists will look at November and say, who cares? Who cares if it's even stolen?
Well, that's definitely what Ralph was just alluding to, I feel, in his comment. I am worried about that. I think what needs to be made very clear, I think it's a two-tiered strategy. One is I think it's very important that Biden and the forces that be that might be a little more with it than Biden, the forces that pulled the maneuver where, Mayor Pete and everybody else dropped out and endorsed that card, their Trojan horse, what they did to our campaign. Those forces better realize that they need our campaign and our voting bloc to win. That's one. And two, I think it needs to be made very clear to people that not voting for Biden in this current situation could be a huge mistake because of various policies, right? Like, relationship with Iran, climate crisis issues. There are a number of ways in which Biden is obviously much, much, much better than Trump. But it's very sad to me that this is the choice we have. And that's why I think we need to go through in a third space. We need a third way. And, Bernie represented that, but what Bernie has brought to the picture can inspire new movements and new forms of leadership. And I hope and really wish to be part of that conversation and that movement myself. I'm personally stirred by these issues, not your traditional academic at all in that sense at all.
Here, Joe Cotchett talks more about what companies should do for people during the crisis.
Go back to that point you just made about Allstate. Now, I didn't know that Allstate was doing, but God bless. Look, we're a great country because there are people in it like you, others, and all states of the world. If they're doing it, God bless them. I think it's phenomenal that there are some people that are going to stand up and say, wait a minute, I am not going to take rent from you. I am not going to take this payment, and I'm going to contribute some of my money to a community activity that is feeding people out there that are now homeless, can't pay their rent. Look at today's New York Times, an extraordinary story about single parents who now have to stay at home. We're living in a crisis, and the real issue is whether the federal government will step up to the plate and enforce what has to be done. That's the real kicker. Will they enforce what has to be done? We're living in very difficult times of people that want to make a quick buck. I am just overwhelmed that many banks are refusing to waive mortgage payments. And I use the word waive. What about simply continuing them until the many states' rules on shelter in place are ended? In other words, you don't have to make mortgage payments on your home while you're stuck at home or whatever you're faced with. I see that under this new, I was just reading an article, under this new CARES Act, only 44% of mortgages are required to be delayed. That means that many people who are out of work, and you see these unemployment rates skyrocketing, who have small condos, apartments, homes, are going to be stuck with their mortgage payments. And you know, and I know, Ralph, there are people sitting there behind some guests today that are clapping their hands on that because they're going to get their hands back on some little house that they can then sell. They're going to foreclose on it. There should be a moratorium on foreclosures. The CARE Act does not deal with that. Those are the states that have to do it. And unfortunately, you know, I know, everyone who's listening knows that it's just we don't have attorney general's offices with hundreds of lawyers in them that can go around and enforce these rules. Therein lies the problem. And what we should do, I happen to be one of those people that believe in the strong admonition that if you commit a crime, you should be jailed. And by that I mean, if you commit an economic crime against society, you should be looking at a jail sentence. When is the last time you saw a Wall Street executive or executives go to jail? It doesn't happen. And that's the problem we're faced with. We're faced with an unequal application of the laws to those of us that live in this fabulous country. I don't want to go off on your last speaker, but I do think that Joe Biden is someone that recognizes this and will hopefully bring us back some civility.
Well, we're almost out of time. We've been talking with Joe Cotchett, who is a prominent litigating lawyer, takes on the big guys from Wall Street to all over the world. And he's an author. He's a landlord who just canceled the rent for his tenants. And it's not the first time he's done it. He's heard from people all over the country. Maybe it will start spreading among the landlord community.
Very good.
David?
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you're going to sustain it. And maybe we have to reevaluate how we view real estate in this country. Should it be as important an investment for people? Could we redo our tax code so we don't have people investing in extra homes that they may or may not need?
That's clearly a significant point you just made. And by the way, who we're really talking about are the homeowners out there that are stuck with a mortgage. And what we need is we need reality in dealing with these big banks. You remember, you may not remember, I don't remember, the Depression, but banks went nuts foreclosing, and we can't allow that to happen. But believe it or not, you pick up the Wall Street Journal, you pick up any business section right now, and you're going to see foreclosures going on. It is scandalous, it is outrageous that we haven't stepped up and passed some emergency laws that's going to prevent that. You're right. However you want to define it, we have to rethink how our economic system is working. I am not talking about socialism. You were talking to one of the great capitalists of the world when you were talking to me. But you have to understand what is reality, what is real, and what works in a society that will make it a community all in of itself.
Ralph, how can we adjust the tax code to make it more sympathetic to renters?
You get a couple of members of the House to introduce some legislation, and you embarrass, I don't want to use the word I'm going to use here, you embarrass the crap, I have another word for it, out of other people that aren't willing to stand up and vote for that legislation.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting